Once again, this is Extending Commerce, Drupal's architecture in action. And if you're looking for a different session, click over on the session screen tab. And thank you for stopping by. So I'm Sean Duncan. I am a technical architect with Digital Pulp. I live in Brooklyn, and our offices, when we were open, are in Manhattan. At the moment, like everybody else, we're dispersed. But this is where to find me on Drupal.org and on Twitter. And these slides are written in CSS and HTML and JavaScript, and they're available online. And so you can find them after the session at talks.seanduncan.org/extendcommerce. So I'm going to very quickly go over coding concepts, because most people are comfortable with these, but there were a few people who weren't, and I don't want anybody to feel left out. So PHP has had elementary objects for a really long time, but it didn't have a full object model until PHP 5, and it's really come into its own in PHP 7. So my metaphor for an interface is the specification for the USB protocol. The specification for the USB protocol describes how USB signals are supposed to travel through a USB cable, and in it describes how a USB cable should be constructed, all the kinds of things that it should do. But it's actually, nothing's being manufactured here. There's nothing that you can use. And so interfaces are much like that. They define the things that classes must implement, but they don't actually do anything. So I'm going to skip over these code examples, since people are mostly familiar with them, but I want to give everybody else at least a basic. For classes, our analogy becomes a little less precise, but there are a lot of different USB manufacturers out there, and each of them has to come up with a way to manufacture their USB cable and the model of cable. They have to come up with a detailed design that's going to get implemented. And a class is much like that. There are a variety of designs, but they're all USB. And so finally, object is the actual USB cable that you hold in your hand. And in programming, it's the class that's been instantiated, it's been initialized with all of its values, stored in a variable, and it's ready to work. Then there's two other concepts that I'm going to use talking about the architecture, the object composition and inheritance. So inheritance. The ancestry of our family dogs is ancient. This is recognizably a canine-like creature. It's from a petroglyph very, 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 very long time ago, and it looks much like a dog. Because our dogs today have inherited common characteristics from our ancestors. In programming, class inheritance means extending some other class, which we call a parent, and the child class inherits all of the parent's qualities, but then is able to override some of them. Composition, in the real world, my metaphor is a car. Here's an assembly line. And cars are made of many distinct components. Exposed here, looks like we can see a brake drum and lots of other components. And each of those is a discrete object. And when you put them together, you get a car. And you can get different kinds of cars by swapping in and out different components. So as a programming concept, composition means designing a class to hold objects from other classes. All right, so here's the part that seems like most everybody came to my session for. We're going to talk about some elements of Drupal architecture. And today I'm going to talk about controllers and plugins and services. So a controller. A controller is a class whose job is to process a user's request and return an appropriate response. Drupal as a whole uses a front controller architecture there's a single point at which all the requests come in, and then they have to get dispatched to the appropriate place. And a lot of the times, that place is a controller. Most of the time when you're writing a controller, you don't have to write the whole thing from scratch. There's a class in Drupal core called base controller. And you can extend that class using the pattern we just briefly looked at called inheritance. So here's a little snippet from the block content controller in Drupal core. And you can see that it's extending controller base. And we've gotten a lot of good documentation now that we're transitioning out of Drupal 8 into Drupal 9. But one of the learnings I will be taking with me from 8 to 9 is at the beginning, there wasn't a whole lot of documentation written for Drupal 8's new architecture. And we're used to being able to go to blog post upon blog post of people who have solved problems. Drupal 8 was in development so long, and the architecture evolved so much over the 5 years that it was being built. Sometimes you would find blog posts that were 4 years old and they weren't accurate anymore. So the learning that I'm taking with me is to go and look at the code. So if you're new to creating custom features in Drupal, one of the places that you can learn a lot is by going actually to Drupal core and finding something similar and looking at how it was implemented. That was a double tap. So how do we get to the controller? How do we connect that user's request with the controller? It happens in the routing system. The routing system connects the user's request with the controller, and Drupal discovers routes by looking in specially named files, YAML files, that are named in a naming pattern, which is your module name.routing.yaml. So here is the block content routing file that routes to the controller we were just looking at. And you can see that each entry starts with an identifier. So we have block content.addPage is the name of this route. The path that it uses is /block/add. And if you enter that route into Drupal, Drupal is going to send that request to the block content controller's add method, which is listed on the controller line. This is how you wire them together. Plugins. So plugins, I look at them as configuration packaged with functionality. All plugins have a batch of configuration, and then those are loaded into the plugins class, and you can add on methods to those plugins to do things with that configuration. And typically, plugins are the kinds of tasks and configuration that you have multiple similar cases, and there's some variation. So rather than creating classes sort of whole cloth or coming up with some way to create them yourselves, the plugin system allows you to create plugins that can get created for you in the right circumstances. And again, plugins usually use the inheritance pattern of extending a base class. So field formatters in Drupal core are plugins. Here we have the plugin for the image formatter. You can see that it's extending another class, the numeric formatter base class. And there's this comment stuff up here at the top. If you're coming to Drupal from some other programming system, there are some other languages that have been doing this in recent years, but really pioneered by Symfony with their annotation system. Comments are not just text that gets ignored, but actually text that gets processed when it's formatted in a particular way. So this part up here at the top is actually part of the plugin's information. It says what kind of plugin this is. It's a field formatter plugin. It states its ID, its label, and the kind of field types that it applies to. Every group of plugins will have particular information that's expected to be up here in these annotations. Plugins are assembled by a factory class. A factory class is a class whose whole job is to make other classes. And then there are services. Services are classes that are specifically created to be used by other classes, to use the composition pattern that we were looking at earlier. Since service objects are used by other objects, they're kind of hidden. Drupal discovers services by looking also in specially named files, the module name .services.yaml. And Drupal's core services are listed in core.services.yaml in the core directory. So here's a service definition, again from the block module. And you can see that, for example, the block repository service, it's named block.repository, and it calls a particular class. And we're going to look at these arguments and what they're for here in a little bit. A powerful approach to composition, it's not the only way to do composition, but a powerful approach to composition that's particularly common in Drupal is called dependency injection. And in dependency injection, the specific objects that are added to the class are injected at runtime rather than being statically declared and hardwired into the class. So let's go back to this service definition that we saw in services.yaml. You see in the arguments section that it's calling for something called @entitytype.manager, @theme.manager, and @context.manager. These are service identifiers just like block.repository. And those end up being arguments, objects that are going to get passed to the constructor for this service. So down here is the constructor for this service. And you can see that where we called for entitytype.manager, we're getting something that is of the entity type manager interface. And we're getting a theme manager interface. And we're getting a context handler interface. And this is where the power of interfaces starts to come in. There can be lots of classes that implement those interfaces as long as they have all the right methods. So when you declare that you are dependent upon the entitytype.manager service, Drupal is free to completely change all kinds of things about the entitytype manager service. Your service will still work as long as it's still entity type manager interface. And you're not saying, I want this specific class. With dependency injection, you're saying, I want a class of this interface. I want a class of these capabilities. And you need to give me what it is that is currently defined as that. So that's why I say it's injected at runtime. And that's very powerful because it gives us a lot of flexibility and room to adapt to new circumstances. Okay, let's talk about extending commerce. So here's the goal. Our goal was to have a donation-specific flow. In standard e-commerce, you browse through a catalog, you pick a product, you choose that product, you add it into your shopping cart. And for certain circumstances, that can work for a donation, especially if you have circumstances where you have actual physical products that are also available. But a lot of nonprofits are simply, what they're doing is they're fundraising online. They're just taking donations. So putting something in the cart doesn't really make sense. They want to donate. The user wants to donate, and you want it to be seamless and frictionless. So you just want to go into the donation. So this is where we're headed. We're headed toward the goal of a visitor being able to click on something that kicks off a donation. And the traditional e-commerce model really isn't there. The information is collected, their donation is collected, and they're thanked. So we're going to start off with a controller, because we're going to have a user request to make a donation, and we want to respond to it in a particular way that's a little different than what e-commerce normally does. So we have a couple of routes here. We have a route for kicking things off because nothing exists yet. We also have a route for getting to various steps in the order, and they both connect the user or send the request to the donation controller. So here is that donation controller. You can see that it implements container injection interface. This is the magic that makes Drupal's dependency injection system work. Normally, when an object is created, PHP calls the constructor. But in our system, there is a point in the code that watches for objects that have this interface, container injection interface, and instead invokes a factory. A factory class, remember, is a class whose whole business is creating or instantiating other objects. But in this case, rather than calling the constructor, the factory calls the create method, because this container injection interface, the thing that it enforces is that there is a create method. So here we have the properties of the object. This is my constructor, so I'm perfectly comfortable having a constructor, and here is the create method that gets called, and we pick out the services from the container that we want to inject, and we send them to the constructor through a call to static. So we're going to look at two methods in this controller. We're going to look at what I call the front controller method, because the user is going to click on /donate to kick off a donation. What we need to do is we need to create behind the scenes. We need to create something that the user is going to purchase, and we need to kick off. We also need to create an order to contain that thing that the user is going to purchase. So it's also possible that the user has left their donation for some reason and come back. So we look to see if we have any stored order. And then if we do, we load that order. Otherwise, we get a new order. And now we have an order. We also create a custom checkout flow for this process because it's a little bit different to check out a donation than a regular checkout. So we get that checkout process, and we redirect the user into that checkout process at the appropriate step. The next step method's pretty similar. The only difference is that we're not creating any orders. We're simply getting the order that's stored in the URL, and we're pulling it up, and we're redirecting the user to the form builder for that checkout order. So that's a controller. There's nothing about PHP that would keep us from putting into the donation controller the logic to create new orders. But it's really a much better programming methodology for your classes to be focused at one job. And so we create a new order service. This new order service has only one job, which is to create new orders. But that allows the donation controller to have only one job, which is to respond to user requests and route the user to the appropriate code that's going to bring up on the screen the thing that they want to see. And this new order service is in the donation container controller by dependency injection. So here's the new order class. It's a service, so it can get dependency injected other services. So we're getting a service that provides the current store that's being used in Drupal Commerce, a proxy for the user account, and the current request stack. This is the primary method of the new order service. And it creates an order. And then it initiates it with an empty price, and it gives it back. That's really all it does. Now plugins. Plugins within plugins within plugins. The checkout process in Drupal Commerce is a plugin because you can have more than one checkout process. You tie the checkout process for to an order type. You can have more than one order type in Drupal Commerce. And then within checkout, there are multiple steps. Each of those steps is a plugin. So here's the checkout flow, which is extending Drupal Commerce's checkout flow. I'm not going to go through every method, but this checkout flow is designed to add some additional steps and also to customize the checkout form a little bit to add an offline donation link. Sometimes certain nonprofits, in addition to collecting online donations, want to have an option for somebody to download a form to mail it in. And to add in some additional steps to the default checkout flow. It's its primary purpose. It also is designed to pull in summaries and present them above the order rather than in a sidebar. Then the checkout panes, you can design custom steps in Drupal Commerce, and there's no need to have a product to purchase, but you have to have something to purchase. Well, in Drupal Commerce's architecture, it turns out that the line items or order items are purchasable. So we define a custom order item donation, and then we created 2 plugins to display different parts of that order item entity's forms for capturing information about the donation. So this plugin is the first of those, and one of the things that it does right up at the beginning is it sets the form display mode for this checkout step, which will be used to render a certain subset of fields from the donation item. So let's have a look. We're going to do the always wildly risky thing and look at some live demo. So here we have Drupal 8 installed with just Drupal Commerce and the code that we've been talking about. And so we click on Donate. I'm just going to go through the simplest case here. I have a test payment gateway installed, which collects billing information, but doesn't actually charge anybody anything because we're not actually paying anyone anything. And we donate. And that created an order in Drupal Commerce. It was very seamless. And that's the whole point of this. There's no there's no sense that you're checking out other than you have to give your credit card information. So it's also possible, sometimes these sites are content rich and you want the user to return to where it was that they were. So we could also have added in the ability to carry with us a parameter that brings the user back to where they started. So we donate again and back to the site, and we go back to the node that we were on. So that's the basic, that's the whole functionality right there. I'm using a controller. The service is instantiating a new order and setting default values. It's also, we have an optional middle step. So if I want to donate in honor of someone, this is now a second plugin, a second checkout step plugin that's using a form mode to display a part of that donation item, to give fields to put in additional information for a dedication. So we get to the end, we've got a summary up at the top so the user can see what it is that they're doing. This was a real commerce transaction. There'd be a credit card form underneath this billing information form. We make our donation, and the thank you screen also carries the information about the donation. And that's the pre-planned presentation. I intentionally am leaving 15 minutes at the end to answer questions. So let me go over to the scroll, because it's just me, to see what kind of questions people have. How do we get access to the slides? The slides are online. I will paste the link in the chat. How's that? There we go. Oh, I see that. Thank you, Selwyn, for helping out before I even saw that you answered that for them. So plugins are used to add some more features to existing ones. Am I correct? Oftentimes that's the case, especially when you're starting out. As I said, the checkout flow is built with a plugin, and steps in the checkout flow are built with plugin. You could write one of those plugins completely from scratch and not overwrite anything else. They have an interface that it looks for. Let's see. Go back to that code sample. You see that it's implementing a checkout pane interface. So if you create a new plugin from scratch and you want to use it as a checkout pane, you have to implement that interface. You don't have to extend something else, but you could, because it's probably going to save you time. See, what test payment module am I using? There's a payment example module in the Commerce project. It's really meant to be an example for how to write a gateway, but the offsite referral gateway that's in that example module, it doesn't take any payments. See. Yes. So I have a request to demo the Ajax amount update that was in the checkout pane. I love it when people look at my code like that. It's a really on the ball question. So what that's about is, I didn't test it in this implementation, in this installation before, but we'll see what we have. So if you're donating monthly, you probably don't want to donate $500 a month. So the formatter that we have for the amount gives you the ability to put in different amounts for one time and monthly. So when you change to monthly, that Ajax amount update comes in and it changes the amounts that are listed here on these radio buttons. Question, is Commerce so nicely documented that you could figure out your way around the myriad of classes to create your modules, or did you just dig through miles of code? Well, it is nicely documented, but shout out to the devs at Centauro. They're just enormously helpful. There's a Commerce channel in Drupal Slack, and they answered all my questions when I was first trying to get to know Drupal Commerce several years ago. But also I use them for this example, one, because we have code for it that we think works really well, but also Commerce itself is really well architected in line with Drupal's architecture system. So it's actually a really great place to go learn a lot about how Drupal's architecture works. And 100% with Dimitris, the code is really well documented. It's really easy to read. Going back to what I said earlier, it used to be that we would go to blog posts to figure out things, and there are lots of good blog posts now, but it's taught me that the first thing to do is go look at the code. Now, what are tags in services? There are some services that the whole batch of them get run through based upon a tag, and that's as much as I remember standing here. Thank you for your question. I would have to go back and look at some of those implementations, but for example, there are access services that they're all tagged. So at a particular point, all the access services run. So this code that we're demonstrating today, it's very close to being available on Drupal.org. A couple wrinkles introduced by the latest version of Commerce that I'm making sure that our code is happy with. So currently you can find it in my sandbox, which you can find off of my my user tab in Drupal.org. But you'll also see, you'll also be able to find it within the next day or two at Commerce Donation Flow. That's right. Gurwinder, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, is reminding us that tags are used to register services that are used differently than others. Event subscribers is a great example. An event subscriber is a service that watches for a particular event to occur and then reacts to that. We heard from in the Dries note that we're continuing our evolution to move away from PHP hooks toward event-driven code. Other question is, would I use Commerce for donations or rather roll something custom now that I've been through this fun? I would 100% use Commerce without any question. Because if you roll something custom, you have to decide how it is you're going to interact with payment services. You have to decide how you're going to deal with refunds. You're going to have to decide everything from scratch. The beauty of Drupal and the beauty of contributed modules and collaborative open source development is I was able to come in and figure out what was different about our case. But all of the common things, charging a credit card, being able to swap one payment, using a payment gateway that you want, all of that stuff, I didn't have to worry about a bit because the Commerce developers had it all handled. I have to say, after many years of being in a room making these presentations and people coming to a microphone, it just feels really odd to have the questions coming in chat. I wish I could hear the tone to better understand where people are coming from. Oh, cool. You can invite people to join you. Does anybody have a longer question? Still have about 5 minutes. Oh, look at that. Okay, Selwyn showed up. I clicked a plus. There he is. Hey. Awesome. Hey, Selwyn.
Hey, I have not fiddled with Commerce in Drupal 8 world yet. I did in 7 and before, and it was wildly complicated. I remember Ryan presenting over and over and over again about, this is the flow. Has it gotten much, much better and much smoother?
It has, and I think credit for that definitely goes to, as Kelly's pointing out, to the folks on the Commerce team, but also credit goes to Drupal for taking the plunge with Drupal 8 to go all in on object-oriented architecture. Before this, there were a few object-oriented packages in Drupal, but most of them were completely procedural, and so that means that everything's in functions. It's in all kinds of different places, and so then you have to try and trace it through. But for example, with checkout panes, all checkout panes implement the checkout pane interface. So if you want to look at all the checkout panes that are in Commerce, if you have an IDE, integrated development environment, you can say, show me all the classes that implement checkout pane interface.
Sure.
And then you can see them all. So from my experience, I did a little bit with Commerce in 7, but this is the beauty of Drupal 8's object-oriented architecture and And then also the gift of services and dependency injection.
Yeah. Which IDE do you use? PHP Storm or?
Yeah, I'm a PHP Storm.
Yeah, me too. I'm such a fanboy. What an amazingly nice product.
And George is pointing out that there are a lot of blank pages on Drupal Commerce's documentation. I'm sure the Commerce guys would love to have people come and extend. Dale's pointing out that the problem with, quote, just read the code is they have a lot of things that are defined, but how they fit together isn't always obvious. And that's definitely true. And we're now at a place where people have, we're almost back, in my experience, the place where we were with Drupal 8 or Drupal 7, where there's plenty of how-tos that people have written. But I guess the point I was trying to make earlier, Dale, was I just Googled blog posts, 5 or 6 years ago when I was trying to figure something out. Now I often go to the code first, and then I go try to read what people are writing. Anybody else have an extended question they'd like to be able to say out loud rather than type in the chat? Someone, maybe you could say how it is that you got down on my moderation panel so that I could click you. What did you have to do?
Oh, I just hit that big red button at the top that says share audio and video.
Okay.
But maybe if you're an introvert, it's pushing that big red button's a bit scary. Sure.
So we have a question. If we make 2 or more plugins, how does Drupal find which one to use?
I'm going to pronounce that Nana Go Wethaman.
Thank you. It depends upon the situation. For example, we were looking at Drupal Commerce, and there's usually something in an administrative UI in which you're choosing things or setting things up. Here for the checkout flow, there in the checkout flow you can choose the order of the steps, and when you go to load that checkout flow, Commerce runs a discovery process that looks for all of the Commerce pane interface plugins, and it lists them all here. And so then we drag and drop them into different steps in the checkout flow, and that gets saved as configuration for this plugin, the checkout flow plugin. And Eric points out coming up to the end of the time. Once again, the survey result, the evaluation link was at the top. And please go and fill that out. Oh, looks like we have somebody else who's got an out loud question. So adding that person.
Yeah, and guys should look, if you have your laptop set up separately, you can look at all the Drupal pets live. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. I clicked plus there. There we are. I'm going to drop you off, Selwyn, so we save some bandwidth. Yes, sir. Mr. Kanazoe, you're on. Do you have a question?
Hello. No.
Okay. I have 1 minute left. Anybody else with a question? You're welcome. Glad you all enjoyed it. And feel free to reach out through Drupal.org if you have any questions. If you're interested in commerce donations, watch for our module to go live in the next day or two, and please contribute.